Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the much overlooked but vital process of mapping the trenches of the Western Front. How did it come about? Just why was it so important? And how did it affect those on the front lines at different points in the Great War? Hi Dan, always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast. And today we're taking a subject that's been requested quite a few times, which is the seemingly simple but actually devilishly complex topic of how do you go about mapping a battlefront, the Western Front in fact, that is 400 miles long and is intensely contested both on the ground, in the air, and even underneath the ground. It's a very complex, very, very deep topic, and I think it's fair to say before we even begin, Dan, that we're only going to be taking excuse the pun, a survey of the survey work.
Yeah, I like that. Good shout to start there. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good point, Spence. I mean, this is an intensely detailed subject. There are loads of moving parts, and we simply can't cover them in one day, in one episode. And I certainly don't have the depth of knowledge to cover every element of it. But there are still, I think, there's real value to covering just a broad sweep of the story of mapping in the Great War. And really its evolution from 1914 right through to 1918, because there are some serious changes. And it's fair to say it goes from pretty basic to very thorough. And that's no great surprise. But I suppose in order to really start telling that story, Spencer, we need to go back really to pre-1914, because mapping's always been a big deal in the British and various other armies. And generally speaking, up to the First World War, it's not been that good.
Well, I think if we'd taken that opinion to the men, and it was overwhelmingly men who were doing that mapping, they might have raised their eyebrows at us. But you have an absolutely fair point there. In Britain in particular, the Ordnance Survey, which British listeners, I'm sure you're very familiar with, probably used it if you're of a certain age, although now we all tend to rely on electronic maps. But the Ordnance Survey had actually been started in wartime in 1791, when the Board of Ordnance had been asked to prepare maps of the English Channel coast in the event that they would need to defend this region in the event of a French invasion. And I think that tells you in some ways the story of military mapping in a nutshell. Military mapping doesn't seem that important until suddenly it's really important. And in 1791, when the English coast is mapped, it actually staggers people at the time how poor maps are of this region, even though it is part of the British Isles. And from then, Ordnance Survey is born. But really serious military cartography, it's in its infancy. It's a new science, effectively. And of course, military cartography, it's a little bit different to just cartography in general. The exact elevation of certain points is of pivotal importance. The depth of rivers in pivotal importance. The details in here are really, really crucial, because if these aren't correct, lives might be lost, battles might be lost. But it has to be said, working for the Ordnance Survey, especially in the early 1800s, not a very well-paid job. It's a very technical job. It's a difficult job. There aren't really that many talented people out there who are willing to do this job for the pay that's on offer. And I think it's fair to say, Dan, you know more about this than I do, but mapping in the Napoleonic Wars, for the British at least, is not necessarily the Ordnance Survey's finest hour.
Yeah, I mean, mapping it in areas, we have to remember as well, areas that haven't really been properly mapped before is particularly difficult. So we see this throughout the Peninsular War. Quite often men go out with a very vague notion of what something looks like. You might get a little better mapping when you look at things like cities or particularly fortified towns, where you can have a bit of time and you can really map out key points. But on, say, the wide open plains of Spain and Portugal and the hills of Spain and Portugal, very, very difficult to get accurate mapping. And of course, that has a huge impact on the battlefront. And, you know, as we move through time as well, particularly when accuracy becomes higher and we really have these much finer margins like we see in the First World War, being absolutely accurate with maps is essential. As we'll get through this, we'll talk about artillery and various other elements, literally shooting off maps. In the Peninsular War, if you tried shooting off a map, you would be wildly out in your estimations. So there's a confidence element here as well. And I think, you know, that's something that we're gonna pick up as we continue through this episode.
This is absolutely true. And just to take that a little bit further, in fact, almost a century on, In 1899, when the British Army goes to war in South Africa, one of the serious problems that the army has is its maps of this region are absolutely abysmal. It's reliant really on some very primitive survey maps that have been drawn up about 20 years before the actual war. Detailed maps just aren't available. And that's one of the reasons the British artillery, the Royal Artillery, has a really hard fight in the early stage of the South African War because it can't shoot off the map in any way, shape, or form. And it's reliant effectively on being able to see a target visually. And that's very difficult when you're fighting an opponent as determined and skilled as the Boers, who are very, very good at taking cover and remaining concealed. And really, the army doesn't really get a grip on mapping South Africa, more or less really for the entire war. Parts of South Africa are mapped. Obviously, it's a huge area. The war's a guerrilla war in the latter stages, but that does certainly convince the army that campaigning abroad, whether it's in the empire or perhaps on the continent, there's going to need to be some sort of mapping element. And yet, in the way that the British military so often does, it then sort of reasons this in its mind and says, well, okay, if we're going to far-flung regions of the British Empire that aren't well mapped, it would be quite useful to take an ordnance survey team with us to start mapping these whilst we're actually in field. But we probably don't really need any maps if we go to Europe because we can just use the French or the Belgian maps that are available there. So we don't need to worry too much about that. And I think that's a typical sort of modern, by that I mean 20th century British approach to things. Good idea founded, experience has proved its value, but well, it's going to cost a bit. We're not going to implement that. We'll rely on French maps. But there's also some problems actually with using those French and Belgian maps.
Yeah, there are. And actually, it comes back to that same year you just mentioned, 1899, when you get something in France, which is called the Cadastral Survey. And it's a series of surveys that go on throughout the country, which are designed to really give a close look, 1 to 2,500 scale of all of the key towns and villages throughout France. In fact, all of the major areas. This is also backed up by something called the Communal Survey, which is on a 1 to 10,000 scale. The problem with this, though, is there's a wide variation in accuracy. Some of these are incredibly accurate, and we see really quite impressive detail. Other ones are wildly inaccurate. And if there's one thing you want when you've got maps, it's uniformity. And this is something that the British and the French are going to find in 1914 that they don't have. There's some supplementary use of other plans and maps which are more detailed, particularly those of canals, mining surveys, and in fact some road networks as well. But the problem is there's no uniform, single, same scale, highly accurate map set in late 1914. And that's going to become a serious problem, and it's really going to hamper the British until the end of 1915 when we see a second set of maps come out that are going to change the game somewhat.
That's absolutely right. And just to take that story up to 1915 and to bounce back to the British, and it is going to be a rather British-centric episode, listeners. That's, I think, a fascinating story, but of course it does interact with the other armies too. But in 1914, the Ordnance Survey is actually ready for war. It actually has a section ready to travel with the army. They're kept in reserve. They don't actually travel with the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. And the War Office actually stands them down. We don't need you. Rest easy. The exact reasons why the War Office does this remain a little bit of a subject of debate, but my own view is someone in the War Office thought we don't need to go out and map France, one, because we can draw upon these French maps, despite their problems, as you've just laid out, Dan, and secondly, the war's probably going to be short. We don't need really expert mapping. So the Ordnance Survey teams actually prepare for war, then they're stood down, and nothing very much happens. And very, very quickly, the dangers of that are found out because, as we know from previous episodes, British Army gets into contact with the Germans in Belgium and very quickly is forced onto the Great Retreat, which is going to carry it over 200 miles in a south-southwesterly direction. And what happens on the Great Retreat is the Expeditionary Force, effectively, it retreats off its own maps. The maps that have been issued only show Belgium and northeastern France, and the army's forced off those maps. And the Ordnance Survey can't produce any maps to replace this. The invasion is causing uproar in France. There's casualties, there's confusion. The French can't really help. They've got their own battles to fight. France is fighting for its national survival here, and polite request, please send us some maps, isn't really going to cut it. And what actually the solution is British officers, as they're retreating south, will go to French post offices and they buy French cycling route maps. And that's what they're using to navigate in the middle and later stages of the Great Retreat, because there's just no other map left. That is far from ideal, Dan. And although I have to salute their ingenuity to just go and buy a map out of a shop, or requisition a map out of perhaps an abandoned shop, imagine trying to steer your brigade or even your division down some French roads in this scorching 1914 summer using a map designed for tourists. And Dan, I know you're a cyclist. How do you find the French cycling maps?
Well, I have to say, I haven't used them before, actually. So French cycling maps, whilst they might have been useful in 1914, I don't think with such high stakes, and remember, we have discussed it before, very high stakes in 1914, don't know that you'd be wanting to trust your unit's cohesion to those. So, it does highlight a pretty major problem. Thankfully, the Great Retreat is accomplished in something like order, albeit there were plenty of close shaves along the way. And actually, it's once those lines settle down following the Battle of the Aisne in 1914 that really this need can be addressed. Finally, there's a pause. British Army, French Army can draw a breath. German Army has been pushed back somewhat. And now men can start thinking about what the situation is going to be going forwards, because it becomes fairly clear that the lines are going to become static following the race to the sea. And once again, Ordnance Survey, who are based in Southampton, are called in, and they're going to draw up the first set of true maps based on the problematic 1 to 80,000 scale maps. These are very, very big picture stuff. Later on, we're going to see right down to 1 in 5,000, much smaller maps. But at first, a set of 1 to 80,000 map is created from predominantly the French series, but also from Belgian maps, which we should add are actually significantly better than the French at the time. So we're going to start to see the formation, if you like, an opportunity to solve a pretty major problem, which is figuring out where we are, where the enemy is, and then, of course, the huge effort of overlaying trenches, very detailed trenches, onto those maps, which is going to create a whole series of headaches which nobody's experienced before.
This is a really interesting point, and I think it's one that we're really apt to forget, that the appearance of the Western Front, we tend to think of it, perhaps removed 100 years, we just think of two neat parallel lines running in this big scar from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. But in fact, as we've hopefully made clear over the previous episodes, the trench systems, as they were, actually stretched thousands and thousands of yards or thousands of meters. And so mapping what is on the other side of not only no man's land, but even your trenches, the German trenches and so on, is actually really, really difficult. It's really challenging. And because the Western Front is changing, in some cases, it's changing the topography of France and Belgium. If we think about the Germans building butts and redoubts and so forth, these man-made structures to provide elevation to their trenches and so forth, you're getting these big changes. And you need really accurate maps to try and capture this. Before you can even put the trenches on them, you need to understand, well, what is the topography here? Where are the ridges? Where are the woods? Where's the water features? And so on and so forth. And for that, you're going to need very accurate maps. And if you want to actually use these for battle, plan on them, determine where to direct artillery fire, assign objectives, use it as areas for aircraft to patrol in, you need precision. And to do that, you're going to have to effectively, from the British perspective, draw up a whole new series of maps. You're going to have to conduct something that's never really been done before. Ordnance survey in another country in the midst of an extremely intense war where the enemy is rearranging the topography. And when the first ranging section comes out from the Ordnance survey, arriving sometime in late 1914 and beginning their work in earnest in early 1915, nobody has done this before in history, and nobody has seen anybody do it before in history. It's really learning as you go. And a lot of the traditional methods that are used by the Ordnance Survey teams aren't really applicable on the Western Front. So Ordnance Survey will look for prominent landmarks and prominent buildings as a standard, measure distances to them, start to calculate distances and ranges, triangulate these. That's been a standard practice in Ordnance Survey since the 1800s. The problem is on the Western Front, prominent landmarks still exist, such as ridges, but buildings, church steeples are a classic, or town halls, they've been destroyed. And in some cases, actually, Ordnance Survey finds that other prominent landmarks that are visible, so water towers in 1915 still exist, the Germans have actually moved them. They've deliberately moved them 10 or 15 yards in a different direction to deliberately throw off survey, which is actually very, very clever. And even if you make that calculation incorrectly, you're going to ruin your entire map. So trusting to the traditional methods of landmarks and so on, it can still be used, but it has to be used in a different way, because now this is a much more complicated problem than Ordnance Survey has ever faced. And for the surveyors actually out on the Western Front, they have to get used to working in and around a war zone. One of my favourite stories about Ordnance Survey is that in January 1915, the first surveyor actually goes out somewhere in the Ypres sector, and he's ready to start carrying out some survey. He's got all his surveying instruments, he's got his equipment, he's uniformed, so he's got some sort of authority, and he gets grabbed and arrested by the British authorities because they assume anybody using these surveying instruments so openly and so blasely just behind the front lines, they must be a German spy. And he has to basically go back to or appeal to his superiors, no, he's one of ours, he's a surveyman, before he gets released. And the very fact that that happens, I think, expresses the sheer newness of this work. And the pressures to actually do it are really, really acute and intense. We've already outlined the difficulties, but there's also a time pressure to do it, because the longer the army goes without accurate maps, the harder it is to be able to conduct actual proper military operations and proper fighting operations. So this is difficult, it's complex, and also it's dangerous. These men are operating in a war zone. There's friendly fire, there's enemy fire, there's friendly fire, sometimes shells dropping short and so forth. And in fact, 67 Ordnance Survey men would actually be killed in the context of the war, and that they're still remembered to this day on a memorial at the Ordnance Survey head office in Southampton. So I think we paint a picture, Dan, very new, very complex, very difficult, potentially dangerous, but absolutely essential. And this is before we even start adding trench lines to these maps.
Yeah, really good point. And there's something to add to that as well, I think. And you could say very inefficient at the start. As you can imagine, this kind of exponential need really growing from late 1914 to make sure that maps can be not only accurately surveyed, but also distributed, and that information shared with other units. This is a real big problem because you've got hundreds of thousands, millions of men out on the Western Front in a very short period of time, and they need to create huge numbers of maps and have this whole system really up from scratch in a short number of months. In fact, there's a French report which is issued in late 1914, which I think illuminates that need a little bit better. It's a comment here on a new survey, and it says the following: the need for something larger, more detailed, and more accurate began to make itself felt after the Battle of the Marne, and from about the beginning of October, armies began to organise a service of topographical information for themselves, with the inevitable overlapping of work and inefficiency of dissemination of information. Indeed, the information from various sources was never properly collated and not referred to the already fixed and available framework. I could totally understand why that would happen with this kind of mad rush to get accurate maps out. There's obviously the various different units working on different aspects of this, but no real centralization in those early months. And then you add on top of that the difficulty of adding on trenches, which are constantly evolving. It's an incredibly difficult task. In fact, just before we move on, Spence, a quick word on trenches here and the importance of it. If you can imagine, and hopefully we've painted a picture, listeners, before now of just how complex trench networks become really by the middle of 1915. It's not just a front line, it's not just a support and reserve, but there are various different trenches leading up and down in different locations. You get one-way trenches, you get areas with priority over others. It's a literal maze in a field in northern France. And one trench, as you can imagine, looks quite a lot like another. In fact, a whole naming system comes about, which also has to be mapped. And there's a couple of clever things that are done, which I find personally really interesting. So, for example, if a battalion from a certain part of London is responsible for digging a series of trenches in a given area, let's say in the middle of the British sector of the Somme, quite often what they'll do, rather than name it Trench 127B, they might call it Oxford Street. And if Oxford Street leads on to Mayfair, in real life in London, if it's a right turn, quite often they'll add that in so that anybody that's familiar with Oxford Street knows, oh, you go down Oxford Street, you turn right and you end up on Mayfair, which probably isn't correct, by the way, but that's not the point. What they would do is they would pick that kind of journey so that a standard soldier in the trenches get some kind of familiarity, and it's much easier to navigate yourself around what is obviously a highly complex set of trenches. So we do see these, if you like, ground level improvements made. Now, these have to be mapped. They have to be put onto a trench map. And then when a new trench is dug the next week, those trenches need to be added as well. Same with any German movements of trench lines, and they need to be completely redistributed all over again. It's a mammoth task, Spence.
It really is. And it's a constant task. And that point you've just made, that whenever the trench lines change for any reason, a new trench is built, and that could even be something like a sap that's being dug out into no man's land, an advanced trench, or a communications trench has an expansion built to it, the maps have to be altered and have to be reissued. And one of the big problems, actually, the British Army has in 1915 is the duty of producing the trench maps as opposed to the topographical maps isn't entirely clear where it lies. The Ordnance Survey just don't have the staff, don't have the resources to produce trench maps. Bear in mind, listeners, they have to map out at very good scale a huge portion of Belgium and northern France. They don't have time to start drawing up individual trench systems, and so that duty would generally fall to the Royal Engineers within a division, or perhaps even at a corps level. But they're always short of time, they're always short of manpower, and so on and so forth. And actually, keeping accurate maps up, who's responsible for it, it's not entirely clear. Effectively, both the Royal Engineers and the Ordnance Survey, I say, well, it's your job to do it. But the importance of it is absolutely essential. If you can't map your own trenches, what hope have you got of mapping German trenches? And listeners, if you've ever looked at trench maps from early 1915, so the early days of this period, and compared them to trench maps of, say, early 1916, it's like night and day. Trench maps for 15, often impressionistic, quite often drawn, I imagine, by a harassed Royal Engineers lieutenant, by flickering candlelight in his dugout with a rat running over his shoes, and he's just happy to get it finished. By early 16, you've got proper printed maps, and we'll come on to printing maps a little later, that show a lot of detail. But there's an elephant in the room, or a rat in the trench, if you prefer, and that's that we're talking about mapping your own trenches. And as you say, Dan, they've got interesting names. Soldiers actually get quite comfortable with moving around their trenches. The naming conventions are very, very useful for this. And even if they don't correspond directly to real-world locations, quite often they'll be named after just familiar things that sound familiar. Pub names in certain cases, or tube stations, or train stations, or sometimes even football stadiums get used at various times in different parts of the trench. And soldiers can pick that up quite quickly. But this is the British trenches where, okay, they might be being shelled and there might be people going to and fro, there'll be some damage. It's one thing to do that, where you can actually get in the trenches and map them. Mapping the German trenches, which, of course, are across no man's land, heavily defended, very, very difficult to observe from ground level, as we know the Germans nearly always have the high ground. This is where, and we've already hinted at it, these mappers have to turn to what is then a very, very modern technology, and that's aircraft, to actually start mapping the German positions. And that's a story in itself.
Yeah, it is. And it adds, again, to the complexity, but it also adds something new, which is accuracy. And, when it comes to actually understanding German positions particularly, it's a complex procedure, because now you have to include the Royal Flying Corps. You have to consider all of the difficult nuances attached to that, let alone being shot down and killed in flying fairly straight and fairly level over enemy positions, which of course is necessary in order to take part in mapping. But at least when these images are taken now, we can start to get a really clear picture of exactly what German positions look like. And actually we see a vast increase in accuracy of British maps of German positions from 1915 onwards. As early as the Battle of Neuve Chapelle in March, actually, aerial footage is used to accurately map German positions. There's a couple of considerations that we need to think about here, though. One of them is that you need to be absolutely vertical over your target in order to get an accurate trench map. Now, the original cameras is quite simply a guy dangling a camera over the side of an aircraft, and if you don't get the perspective right, what might be just a tiny amount of a degree off full vertical is gonna eventually lead to enormous errors in your mapping. So it's not until fixed cameras are actually put down, which can guarantee that the aircraft is straight and level, the camera's straight and level, that you can get that perspective right. But we do eventually see, if you like, a mosaic of images created, which are then transposed onto the existing trench maps. And they can be of different scales, 40,000, 20,000, and then right down to 10 and 5,000 are going to be issued throughout the Great War. Just want to pick up something you mentioned a second ago there, Spence, which is really interesting and maybe something that we sometimes overlook. And that's the idea of mapping both your own trenches and the enemy trenches. And in fact, having those details on the same map. As you can imagine, there's a pretty high risk that if something like a trench raid comes in and manages to grab one of your own maps, which has your own trenches on it, that's going to be a pretty big deal. In fact, if you give away your entire trench network accurately mapped to the enemy, that's going to be a major problem. In fact, within quite a short time, British front lines are only going to be marked. There are secret maps that contain British lines in detail, but they're not allowed in the front line. So there's some real difficulty in just navigating that kind of set of circumstances. So there's lots of things we need to consider with regard to mapping. German lines, of course, are going to evolve all of the time. And as you say, the Germans are going to make quite a big deal of trying to confuse British surveyors, especially as the war goes on and things like artillery become so vital to the battlefield. Just briefly, before we move on, just something very quick here, because down on the tactical level, 5,000, 1 to 5,000 scale maps, which are really the smallest that are produced in the Great War and issued to troops on the ground, are absolutely vital, but they're slightly problematic in the same sense. But there is some idea here of just how important this becomes. And I just want to read from that same report that we touched on earlier, which refers specifically to 5,000 maps. It says the following. About February and March 1916, the first British 1 to 5,000 plans were issued. In the French army, the 1 to 5,000 issue has always had a fairly large place. There is no doubt that something bigger than even the 1 to 10,000 is wanted for infantry work in an intricate system of entrenchments and during stationary warfare. But British mapping units have been unable to cope with this demand except in a few cases of special importance. Now, that, I think, highlights just how important that fine detail is when it comes to understanding particularly trenches on battlefields. And we see this on the ground, actually, Spence, because as this war progresses, artillery is going to become such a big deal. In fact, could you argue that mapping and artillery are about as closely linked as anything else in the Great War?
Without a shadow of a doubt. And in some ways, although we could possibly over-exaggerate this, and I appreciate as the Royal Artillery's historian, I'm always going to over-exaggerate the importance of the Royal Artillery. We could argue that mapping initially is responding to a need from the artillery. And just to take us back a little bit here, when the Ordnance Survey begins and mapping of the Western Front begins in earnest, what's really driving this in terms of urgency are the Royal Artillery. The nature of the Western Front means that even if you wanted to, it's incredibly difficult to carry out visual engagement with your artillery against an enemy target. There's parts of the Western Front in early 15 you can see the German trenches and you can bombard them. But if you want to shoot deeper into the German position, if you want to engage machine guns further behind the line, or you want to try and disrupt reserves, or crucially, you want to try and engage German artillery, well, you can't do that visually. It's just impossible. And so there's a lot of pressure from the Royal Artillery, who have an understanding of the need to shoot from the map, so to speak. We need accurate maps of where the position behind the Germans, and then using aerial reconnaissance, we can start to identify perhaps where the enemy locates his guns, etc. We can bring fire to bear on them. And so there's a huge amount of pressure, or not pressure, demand really from the Royal Artillery. Please give us accurate maps so that we can start firing in a much more scientific way, rather than just saying put 50 rounds onto that village there. Instead, you can start saying, I want 50 rounds of shrapnel onto grid reference XYZ, etc., etc. And it becomes much more accurate, much more scientific. You can organize the weight and density of your fire in a much more scientific and precise way. And it's absolutely essential because, especially in 1915, there aren't that many Royal Artillery guns available and none of them have that much ammunition. So you want to try and make every single shot count. Best way to do that is accurate maps that you can then model the German position upon to. And in fact, the success of mapping to support the artillery, I think, is a huge impetus for continuing this work and indeed accelerating it. And a hero, really, of the first ranging section of the First World War, a man called Captain Winterbotham, He actually earns a nickname in early 1915. Somewhat disputed this nickname. He may have given it to him himself, but it's a great nickname, and I'm going to reference it here. So Captain Winterbotham becomes nicknamed Artillery's Astrologer because he has this seemingly unerring ability through his maps and through his survey work to guide artillery shells onto their target. It's almost mystical. And that actually is the name of, if you're interested in reading a lot more about this in very, very great detail, the best book on the topic is called Artillery's Astrologers, A History of British Survey and Mapping on the Western Front by Peter Chassaud. It's out of print now. You might have to get it from a library as it's very expensive. But if you want to know the absolute nuts and bolts of how this was done, that's the place to do it. But I digress. The point being that the success artillery has as a result of superior mapping really drives mapping forward. And quite quickly, it starts to become a self-reinforcing cycle. As the maps get more accurate, as cooperation with the Air Force becomes better, it's still quite crude, you can start to deliver more and more fire and more accurate fire. But it's not going to work unless you know where the German position is, whether this is German trenches, German artillery pieces behind the lines, whether it's where the German reserve positions are likely to be, and so on and so forth. And this is where I think we start to see the modernity of the First World War, because more and more the mapping section, the Ordnance Survey, has to rely on aircraft to actually carry out this work. Now, I stand to be corrected on this, listeners. If you work for Ordnance Survey, please feel to write in and tell us I'm wrong. But I understand the Ordnance Survey in 21st century has 2 dedicated aircraft that are just part of the department that it can use for surveying. In 1915-16, as you've made the point, Dan, it doesn't have any aircraft. It has to rely on its cooperation from the Royal Flying Corps, which is always in demand. It always has to do stuff. And of course, it's flying into hostile territory it's being shot at. But the very fact that the RFC does fly many of these missions on behalf of the Ordnance Survey, I think shows the importance that the RFC is willing to risk aircraft and pilots and observers, precious resources, trained men, powerful machines to actually carry out this work, because mapping is almost a battle within itself. And if you lose that battle, if the Germans stop you from mapping their trenches but can map yours, you're going to be in a really difficult position.
Yeah, and I think there's a large point to make here, because of course you have mentioned the importance for mapping for the artillery. The importance of mapping prior to an attack is understandably absolutely enormous as well, as is though map distribution. And I think this is a really key point, because it's one thing having a map, but another thing to get it to the right people at the right time and with the right information on it. And being able to distribute maps, which really is the preserve of officers in the early part of the war, that is going to change though, and I think in quite almost a war-winning way. It's really, you've got to think about the logistics. Okay, one thing, we can map these trenches. Yep, another thing, we've got aerial reconnaissance, which is giving us those accurate positions. But how do we get them to the guys in the line? And with these maps changing on a regular basis, it's again another mammoth task. But map distribution is quite a unique one. We actually get the development of map depots behind the line. And an officer from a battalion who's given that specific role is able to go back on a regular basis to a known map depot, ironically marked on a map in the first place so it can find it, and then pick up to 10 copies of a given map. As soon as word comes out, yep, we've got a new version, and these are quite often the same maps that have been amended with new trench lines on, he can go back, pick up 10 versions of it, and then distribute it to men throughout the battalion. That's all well and good in some senses, but when you go into the attack, what if those 10 men, of which maybe only 6 of those maps are going to go forwards, what if those guys become wounded or casualties or killed? All of a sudden, you're going to have men who are fairly leaderless. And we see a really big change, actually, Spence, in 1917 at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where for the very first time, other ranks are going to be distributed maps on a huge level. We're talking tens of thousands of Canadian troops who are going to go over the top, are going to have a map in hand so that they know if they get lost or if there's any confusion, they can work it out for themselves. I think there's a couple of things to bring out with it. One of them is quite literally that the British Army starts to trust the other ranks in the trenches. And we're going to see a really positive effect at the Battle of Vimy Ridge for this, Spence.
Up until this point, there's been some limited use of maps for soldiers with specialist tasks, and trench raiders are often shown maps and briefed on maps. But on a large scale, actually taking maps into battle, this is a novelty. Now, there's been attempts to train troops on models of the German trenches. That's another fascinating aspect that is only possible because of mapping. You can actually, with sufficient labor, you can recreate a model. And these have been in use actually in the British Army really since late 1915 onwards. But one thing that's very, very noticeable in Battle of Loos, especially at the Battle of the Somme, is once you're in the German trenches, it's very difficult to actually keep your sense of direction, to understand where you're going. We've hinted at this throughout the series, really. Fighting in a trench is very, very difficult. It's claustrophobic, it's confusing, it's very intense, your adrenaline levels are extremely high. And even once a position's been captured, you're in a completely alien trench. And it might have looked very simple on a map, very easy to follow, but you don't have a map now. You're desperately trying to remember what direction you're supposed to be going in. There might be German signs in there. You can't read them, you can't understand them, or they might have been blown off the walls. Not helpful, and so troops lose direction. They don't know where they're going. They don't know what's happening to them. The large-scale issue of maps at Vimy Ridge is fascinating because it reflects two things. One, as you say, Dan, a growing confidence at the tactical level in the British Army. If you think about the attack at the Battle of the Somme, first day of the Somme, in many parts of the front, the assumption is the infantry aren't really well trained, they're not experienced. We're just going to have to give them a very, very simple plan of attack. Fast forward just under a year to Vimy Ridge, now there's a lot more trust in the troops because they are battle hardened, they are better trained, they are following the platoon tactics that have been laid out in SS 143 training pamphlet. And so there's a lot more trust that individual small units will be able to fight forward. They'll be able to actually seize positions, and once they've taken a position, move on. And the only way you can do that is if they have a really good understanding of the ground. And so maps start to be issued which show German trenches. And this is really useful tactically. So if you're a platoon leader, a lieutenant, and you've gone forward, your platoon's taken a position, and perhaps you're taking fire from the flank, you can, if you've got cover, you can quickly unfurl your map and work out, well, I think it's coming from that German strong point over there, which is marked on your map. And this allows you to react to it a lot more. So understanding maps, understanding the ground, and having them issued at a low tactical level, I think two things. One, as I've already mentioned, it's superior tactics, but also the scale of mapping is now vast. We've gone from having a surveyor arrested on the Western Front in January 1915 to now not only are there accurate maps available for just about any position the British Army is going to fight on, but they can also be distributed in their thousands upon thousands.
Yeah, and I mean we can go back, I think, to a fairly standard phrase here, and I wonder if it's something that's got a kind of we've got to throw into the mix with all of the great advances of the First World War. Those things where we see the introduction of new weapons, so aircraft and tanks and all of these kind of things that quite often are put down as war winners. I wonder, Spence, I'm going to throw in there just to see what your thoughts are here, that actually the improvements in maps should be considered in that conversation. Quite simply, inaccurate maps cause casualties. Whether that's from people getting lost, taking the wrong direction, not knowing where the enemy is, or vice versa, the enemy knowing where you are. What is really important, I think, here with the terms of inaccurate maps, again, it takes us back to artillery. It's quite simply confidence, and it's confidence in the infantry that the artillery is going to hit where it's aiming at. If the artillery's got accurate maps, it's going to fire accurately. If it fires accurately, the infantry can follow it more closely. If it can follow it more closely, it's got a much better chance of following that barrage and breaking through the enemy lines. Would it be fair to say that mapping in that sense, which increases the efficiency of the artillery and therefore the confidence of the infantry, does that need to be in the equation for a real war changer?
I think it does. You put me on the spot with this, but as you were saying, making your statement, I found myself nodding along, because without this mapping, the artillery, which in many ways is the king of the battlefield in the First World War, the artillery cannot do what it does. It cannot deliver these accurate creeping barrages with multiple lanes and layers. It cannot find German artillery, fix it and knock it out. It cannot react to calls from either a close support aircraft or the infantry itself saying, we need fire support in this location. That's not helpful to the artillery. But if the unit that's in trouble or needs support can give grid references, then suddenly the artillery can bring a prodigious amount of shell into that area. And indeed, by late 17, that's really become the Royal Artillery's calling card. ability to identify German artillery and engage them and potentially knock them out, and the ability to lay down multiple lane creeping barrages of absolutely astounding complexity. Sometimes 6 creeping barrages moving alongside or interacting with one another at the same time. And probably the greatest success of the mappers and the Royal Artillery is at Third Ypres, where about 90% of all the German artillery positions in the Ypres sector are identified and are brought under fire at some point or another, which is a staggering result. Absolutely staggering. And so I think you're absolutely right to say that mapping is a crucial part of Allied success in the First World War. Is absolutely right, because without it, you can't do any of this. You could have double the number of guns the Allies have, but without accurate survey, you're not going to get any rounds on target. You're not going to actually engage the enemy. And so, absolutely crucial. And what's interesting is, or especially interesting on top of this, is the growing complexity of this system. You're starting with just surveyors, growing to include aircraft. As the war goes on, it starts to include sound ranging as a form of survey as well. So sound ranging is where the British, or the French for that matter, have listening devices. They pick up the sound of a German battery opening fire, and pretty quickly, using a primitive analog computer, they can triangulate from where those shots are coming. And because their maps are so good, they can then plot it on a map and start shooting at that position as well. And sound ranging is in some ways a technical marvel of the First World War, but sound ranging doesn't work unless you have an accurate map. And so I think, Dan, the point you've made, that the battle for control of maps and the accuracy of maps is absolutely essential. It's almost a battlefront of its own. And ultimately, by 1917, because of, not least because of more and more resources dedicated to this, the Allies have got a very, very good picture of the German trenches. It's not completely accurate because the Germans are doing everything they can to throw the Allies off. They're concealing things. They're laying false positions. There's a real battle going on here. But by certainly mid to late 17, the British have got a good picture of where the German static defences are and are very good at bringing them under fire. But there's a certain irony here, because just, I think, as survey and British mapping reaches really the peak of its efficiency by the end of 1917, as we've already heard, 90% of German artillery batteries identified at Third Ypres. We've reached that pinnacle, and then in early 1918, suddenly the front starts to move again when the Germans launch their spring offensives.
Yeah, and this is a serious problem. In fact, it's one I think that you could argue, in retrospect, the British and later on the Germans really should have anticipated to a certain extent. It's all well and good to map the front lines and a couple of miles either side of it, perhaps a dozen miles either side of it. But what if you then either have to advance in large bounds, or more importantly, in March 1918, you have to retreat in a very quick manner. And this is something that the British encounter on the 21st of March, really to the end of that month for the very first time. All of a sudden, they're advancing off their own maps. Quite simply, they're pushed back so far and so fast by the launch of the German spring offensive in and around the Somme region that they advance beyond the range that they've previously mapped in detail. Now, I think one of the things that we've just discussed there, the idea that mapping could be a war winner, you could also argue that perhaps the strongest evidence of that, ironically, comes in the fact that they don't have any maps in March 1918, and there is a proportional lack of ability to fight with things like accurate artillery when in the retreat. And of course, bear in mind, this is an absolutely enormous retreat by the scale of the time, and so you've got guys really pedaling backwards towards their base depots, looking at maps which might be accurate in terms of finding where churches are and various towns and villages, but they don't have any positions marked on them because it's not on the fighting front. And so we see in a number of examples just how problematic this is. In fact, going back to that same report we've referenced several times, this segment literally is called The British Retreat in March 1918. It says the following: during this period, the rapid movement made the question of continuous map issue on a large scale almost impossible to deal with. A large amount of the actual fighting was done on the 1 to 10,000 scale. Hitherto, very few attempts have been made to produce a trench map on this scale. There is no real reason against it, but it implies printing in grey instead of colour and has been the usual practice. The line finally steadied in such a position that for the most part it remained on well-mapped country, but in the 5th Army sector it had been pushed beyond it. Immediate steps were taken to extend the topographical survey well backwards to provide for any further eventualities. That gives a little glimpse, not only in the logistics of trying to distribute maps on the retreat, but also to try and continually map places in case you have to go back further. It really did send quite a few shockwaves through the British line. In fact, it does have a positive effect, though, because when it comes to the advance in 1918, so you start to see that the British are at least thinking ahead and saying, well, what's further down the road than what we've currently covered?
It does. And just to add weight to all this, the retreat in 1918 on Fifth Army's front, so that's the Somme front, which the quote just referenced, very, very chaotic, very difficult, very hectic. A lot of equipment's lost, including a huge number of maps. People lose their equipment, positions are overrun. The Germans capture more maps, it's estimated, in that spring offensive than at any other point in the war, because the collapse is so quick in a number of positions that maps are just lost. People don't have time to destroy them and so on. Ironically, that doesn't really avail the Germans much, because they've forced Fifth Army out of its prepared defenses, and it becomes a much more open battle in the coming week or so. And the fact that Ordnance Survey has to really rush to this front the moment it stabilizes to start providing survey behind it is testament to the kind of work that Ordnance Survey has to do. And it's not only actually carrying out the surveying, because the rapidity of the retreat, the loss of equipment, the loss of maps, and the fact that in some cases Fifth Army is retreating off its map means you need to issue brand new ones. Fortunately, the Ordnance Survey can do that, because in the spring and summer of 1917, when the U-boat offensive is really tearing up Allied shipping lanes in the glory days of the U-boat, if you will, there's a real concern in Britain that maps that are, at this stage, they're being printed in Britain and then shipped over to France, that the U-boats are going to cut that off. Maps aren't going to make it to France, and it's going to be a serious battlefield problem. So in 1917, the Ordnance Survey actually opens the Ordnance Survey Overseas branch in France with the specific duty of printing maps within the country to prevent them being disrupted by U-boats. And it's a fairly sizable department, 103 men and 46 women. And they really proved their worth in the German Spring Offensive, because in a fortnight from the 21st of March until when the front really stabilizes in early April, the Overseas branch produced 300,000 new maps and sent them out, all within a 14-day period. That's some prodigious production of maps. And also, I think it speaks to the strength of British communications. They're whistled down to the Fifth Army front, put in hopefully the hands of the right people, especially the artillery, who we've already mentioned. They need these maps to be able to shoot accurately, which certainly must have played a role in allowing the line to stabilize. And one thing that's a little bit interesting from the German perspective is the Germans break through, of course, or not exactly break through, but certainly deal this huge blow to Fifth Army, push Fifth Army back a long way. The Germans outrun their own maps as well. They've got pretty detailed maps really up to the old Somme front line and perhaps a little bit beyond that. But they actually push beyond this and start pushing much deeper. And the Germans find themselves with difficulties of maps. And although it's anecdotal because it's from British sources, it might not be completely accurate. Apparently, in some cases, German artillery is reliant on British artillery maps that have been captured in this advance, but turned the opposite way around, turned sideways effectively so they can see into the British lines. It's anecdotal, it could be apocryphal, but I think it conveys something, even if it's that anecdote is a tall tale told to impress Royal Artillerymen. It conveys something about how important maps are, not just in static warfare, but in a moving battle.
It does indeed. And, as we've kind of, I hope, discovered and covered in to some extent throughout this episode so far, it's really, to my mind, Spence, as we're discussing kind of this, what might be seen to some as kind of a mundane topic. And I hope it doesn't come across that way, because the importance of this element in terms of increasing efficiency of so many other units really can't be overstated, in my opinion. It's something that, the guys on the ground absolutely need. The guys in the artillery positions absolutely need. And the enemy, of course, wants to know as much as they can about their opponents. All of that to be, if you like, put down onto one convenient thing that you can stick in your pocket and take into battle. It's absolutely essential. And even today, when we, if we kind of flick to the modern day and look at these in terms of how they are as a historical resource, the value of maps in understanding what is ultimately an incredibly complex battlefield over a 4-year period is absolutely essential, because what we effectively is a snapshot of those battlefields at a given moment in time, each dated. You can see the evolution of these lines, and incredibly, they can be overlaid onto things like satellite imagery today. And it's really remarkable just how accurate they can be. I've done this a number of times in various projects, including doing some things on the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we overlay a 1917 or a 1918 map onto the modern satellite image, and it overlays perfectly. To think how that could be done in such dire situation in 1914, 15, or any year of the war, it really does, I think, shine a light on just how impressive this work is. And of course, how much it evolves throughout the wartime period. In total, in fact, spent 34 million maps are produced by the Army Printing Section just in the British Army alone during the Great War. If anything's going to tell you how important this topic is, that number, I think, does it quite well.
I'm really glad you brought up the topic of accuracy, because there is the third-party software program Linesman, which you can use to actually carry out, you put trench maps onto your device when you're out on the battlefield, so you can stand in a field somewhere and say, well, actually, we're stood in Piccadilly Junction Trench here, and it's amazingly accurate. Even now, those First World War maps, of which many are preserved, in fact, the fact that so many are printed means, fortunately, we have a really, really impressive selection that are preserved, and some still actually turn up occasionally at auctions and things like this. They're incredibly accurate. You could use them to navigate yourself around France or Belgium to this day, and in obviously a far less hazardous circumstances. And that precision isn't just for show. It isn't just for pride of the survey department or the mapping department. It's because, as we've hopefully made it clear, listeners, this is an essential component of modern war. And I'd argue too, it's something of a revolutionary element of modern war, because the accuracy of the surveys that are carried out is only possible because of the use of aircraft. If you don't have those aircraft, if this war takes place before powered flight, there's no real way that the surveyors could map behind German lines, for example. But the fact that mapping and aerial reconnaissance and later radio and signal reconnaissance all come into their own in the First World War, it's one of the reasons why the First World War is considered by many academics to be a revolution in military affairs, such a revolutionary war in terms of technology and equipment, that it sets the tone for wars for decades, if not centuries to come. And all of these pieces come together to create their own miniature battlefront, which is really, it's fought on ranging tables, and it's fought by cartographers and surveyors who might never fire a gun or pull a trigger or pull the pin out of a grenade. Very unlikely that they will, although as we've made it clear, a number of them are killed in this war. And yet the work they do is every bit as essential, ultimately, to Allied victory as the work of the infantryman, the artilleryman, or the fighter pilot. And I think that's what makes mapping of the Western Front such a fascinating story. And listeners, I hope you found it fascinating.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Nice one, Dan. I thought that would rattled along. I liked it, but I like talking about artillery, so I'm
fair enough.
Biased.